starting on Yud Gimel Amid Aleph.
Wait, Yud Gimel?
Amid Aleph, today's daf. Right on the top, we're starting 4 lines from the top. Omer Rafram Bar Papa.
Okay.
Again, yesterday we talked about the Isser, the prohibition of washing oneself on a Taanis Tzibur on a public fast. So on this, Omer Rafram Bar Papa, Omer Rav Chizda, Kol Shu Mishum Ovel, any Taanis that is established because of mourning, because of Avelus. The great classical example, Kigoin Tisha B'Av, like the night of Av, which we fast for the destruction of the 2 Beis Hamikdash. And the reason why that is specific is because we now know that in Bavel, which is to say in the diaspora, we only take on all the stringencies of not washing, not smearing, not having relations, not wearing leather shoes, only on Tisha B'Av. And of course, Yom Kippur, but that's rabbinical. That's biblical in nature. But of all the rabbinical fasts, it's only Tisha B'Av that reaches the level of what we would call Avelus. So Kol Shu Mishum Ovel Kegoin Tisha B'Av, or Va'ovel, an actual Ovel, who's obviously greatly pained by the loss of a relative. Also, bein b'chamin bein b'tzoynon is forbidden to wash sai with hot water or cold water. Now, in fact, the halacha is that for the 7 days of Shiva, we are not allowed to wash ourselves. There are Ashkenazim that in fact do not wash themselves all 30 days. The entire Shloshim do not bathe. I wouldn't want to stand next to them, but that's the reality. Anyways, Kol Shuhu Mishum Tanug, but any fast that is established really because of pleasure, meaning that I'm taking away pleasure because I want to feel and be part of the tsar of the community. I want to have empathy. I want to show empathy with the pain. Kegoin Taanis Tzibur, like a public fast, i.e. for the lack of rain. B'chamin also, with hot water it's aser. B'tzanoin mutter, with cold water you're allowed to bathe. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Aidi bar Ovin, Av ana nami tanina v'noya linas amer chatzois. And in fact, our Mishnah says, and they locked up the bathhouses. Now, the bathhouses, by definition, the mikvahs, are hot, which means we only lock up the hot baths. The cold baths, therefore, are perfectly legitimate. Or as Abaye says, Amalei Abaye, says Abaye, by the fact that it says they locked up the bathhouses, the merchets, the ibit sign also, but if cold is also, it should have said we stopped up the rivers. We blocked up the rivers. We put guards all around the rivers that nobody should bathe in the river. Since, of course, that's impossible, here's the proof that bathing in cold is okay on a regular Taanis Tzibur that's not about Avelus, but is in fact about Tanug, holding yourself back from pleasure and having empathy with the pain of the community. Amar Rav Shisha Bereida Rav Aidi, says Rav Shisha, the son of Rav Aidi, Abba Hachi Kashale, my father had this problem with the Mishnah. Mechti, let's see. Tanan, it says, Asa Berechitza. The Mishnah puts a broad brush when it talks about Taanis Tzibur, the public fast. It says it's Asa to wash yourself. And then the Mishnah's other ruling, locking up the bathhouses. Normally, what do I need it for? Obviously, you lock up the bathhouses. I'm not allowed to bathe on a public fast. With hot water, it's prohibited, but on a regular Taanis Tzibur, cold water, it's allowed. And if anybody's ever gone into one of these fancy baths, especially in Europe, you know there are hot baths, and then corresponding, there are cold baths. You're allowed to go into the cold bath. You're not allowed to go into the hot bath. I had the Zechia once. I was in Strasbourg, France, and somebody took me to one of these Turkish baths, and that's when I discovered all these different type of baths. Anyways, Lema Messiah Lay. We could say the following Braise proves Rav Chizda. Braise says, Kol Chayde Tfilas, anybody who became Tomei and needs to immerse in a mikvah, Toivlim Kedarkan, is allowed to bathe in the usual manner on a Taanis Tzibur. And the Gemara takes it, and the Mishnah takes it further. Not just a regular Taanis Tzibur, but Bein B'Tisha B'Av, Bein B'Yom Kippurim. Whether on Tisha B'Av or Yom Kippur, if a person's time to toivel, a person's time to immerse in a mikvah arrives plitzling on Yom Kippur or Tisha B'Av, you're allowed to go to the mikvah. Okay? Now, so now the Gemara said we're now on 13.8.2. 13.8.2. Umay. And what is he immersing themselves? Give me 1 second. Give me 1 second. We actually have a potty downstairs. Oh. Going on the toilet. Okay. This is the back room. I think it's downstairs. Okay, I'm sorry about that. My granddaughter is here for a minute, and she's Baruch Hashem learning how to use the bathroom. Anyways, here we go. So the Gemara says, "B'mai." In what case are they allowed to immerse themselves? 13.8.2. If you say they're allowed to bathe themselves, they're allowed to go into the mikvah, a heated mikvah. So now this Gemara did not know from our mikvahs. Listen to this. Tevila b'chamen miyika? Is there such a thing as toiveling in a hot mikvah? Such a thing is just not possible. A heated mikvah. Shuvininu. You need the hot water, by definition, has to be drawn over the fire, over a vessel of fire, and therefore it's disqualified as a mikvah because mayim shuhuvin is parcels and mikvah of barasah. You have to have natural flowing water. Okay, unbelievable.
Yeah, well, you know.
Yeah.
Not that. The Gemara in Masechet Yoma says by the Kohen Gadol when he had to go to the mikveh 5 times, right?
Right. Yeah.
So he was an old guy. He couldn't take cold water. So they used to take hot iron and they dropped it into the water and that warmed up the water. So it doesn't have to be Mayim Shuvim.
No. So the answer.
Then there's another way. If you already have 40 so of kosher water, you could add hot water to it.
Right. So here is the situation. If you ever saw an Eretz Yisrael, you're right, Daddy. You're absolutely correct. The Beis HaMikdash answer is very simple. First of all, in the Beis HaMikdash, there were no Isurei D'Rabbanans. All the Isurei D'Rabbanans disappeared in the Beis HaMikdash. Number one. So all Gezeris D'Rabbanan did not exist. Number two.
Yeah, with Mayim Shuvim you can't use.
Number two. Because it was Yom Kippur, and Yom Kippur was the number one day of the year, it was the greatest spectacle of the entire year, outside of maybe the Simcha Beis Sheva. No, it was bigger than the Simcha Beis Sheva. So everything was prepared. So the iron bars were melted, were prepared, were heated up before Yom Tif, and they were thrown in and they were all worked out. If you ever go, whether to the Ariz mikvah in Eretz Yisrael or to these mikvahs that they found on the side of roads, there's one leading out of Yerushalayim that I once toiveled in, literally off the side of the road. It was
nice and cold.
Nice and cold. And the reason for that is because those mikvahs, Daddy, were problematic when it wasn't the rainy season. Keeping them at 40 saw was difficult enough. The idea of putting in hot water over and above 40 saw was almost unheard of because you had enough trouble keeping them at 40 saw. Number three, a regular mikvah, nobody is going to have time to heat up metal rods and dump them in. It's just not happening. Okay, so the Gemara, in fact, is taking the regular case. And the reason you need to say this is because we're going to come to Chamar Tiveria. The Gemara is about to get to Chamar Tiveria. So that's
Right.
how you see this thing. Jerry, yeah, you want to pipe up?
I want to tell you a great mikvah story.
Go ahead.
Oslo, Norway.
Oslo, Norway. Okay.
I go into the mikvah, nice and warm. Rabbi Wilhelm tells me, put on my shorts, go outside, and jump in the snow.
So I am going to tell you guys my story. The mikvah of the Baal Shem Tov in Mezhebush. The mikvah of the Baal Shem Tov in Mezhebush. The story goes like this, that the Baal Shem Tov was in a field in Mezhebush and he had no water to wash Netilas Yadayim. So he fell on the floor and banged on the ground and said, Rabbeinu Shloim, I'm not going to move from here. I will not be over on even one pinky of a Rabbanon, of an Issa de Rabbanon to go without Netilas Yadayim. And lo and behold, a miracle happened. And all of a sudden, a creek opened up right in the middle of that field. What makes it unbelievable is that, in fact, the creek is still there. There's no reason why it's there in the middle of a field. Anyways, about 10 years ago, they finally built a mikvah on top of this creek. The water in that mikvah is so cold, it makes the Ariz mikvah seem heated. That mikvah, you go in there, you get hypothermia coming out. You walk into that mikvah, you feel all your averos get frozen. So this is the mikvah in the middle of a field in Mezhebush, right smack dab in the middle of a field in Mezhebush. Favorite story. That mikvah is so cold, I can still feel it to this day. That's how cold it is. And Daddy, if you don't believe me, ask Uncle Laser. Uncle Laser.
You went there?
I did. That was, remember, the year you didn't come with us on that trip. So I asked Uncle Laser. He went in. He's still shivering to this day. Cold it is. Anyway, so here we go. Ella, says the Gemara, we must be talking about cold water. The chayve tibul in. Those who are obligated to immerse because the days of their tumah are over. Now they have to go to the mikvah. There are a lot of tayvul, even on Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av. In Shiachir Eloi, but other people are not allowed to bathe in cold water. So this baraisa substantiates of Chizkiah's ruling. No, loy nitzcha elo Tiveria, lechame Tiveria. We're dealing with the hot springs of Tiveria. Since the hot springs of Tiveria are a legitimate mikvah, right? Therefore, the guys who need the mikvah, even if it's your Tisha B'Av Yom Kippur, could be toivel in the Chame Tiveria. Everybody else, of course, cannot. But according to this, it's possible that everybody else is allowed to wash themselves with cold water even on Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur. So we have no proof. Let's look at the end of the brisa. Rab Chanina Sigan Kayanim. Rab Chanina, the vice Kohen Gadol, said as follows: Kedai hu beiselekenu la'abid alav tevila. The house of our God, the house of the Rebbeinu Shalom, is enough that la'abid alav tevila, that we should lose because of it a timely immersion. Pam achas b'shana. In other words, says Rabbi Chanina, he said, forget about it. Nobody is allowed to go to the mikvah on Tisha B'Av. When we're being misabel on the Churban Bayis, today is the day of your tefillah. No, go tomorrow. The and mutter. And if you say that with cold water, you're allowed to. Yerchatz b'tzayin, let him toivel in a cold mikvah. Amar Papa ba'asu de lo shriach tzayin, in a place where cold water is not available. So the Tanakama allows for a mikveh. Tanakama allows if the time for the mikveh arrives on Tisha B'Av, you're allowed to toivel even in the Chami Tiberia. But Chanina would answer it out of you're supposed to be misabel on the Churban Bayis. But both agree that washing oneself with cold water is allowed on Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur. Rav Chanina speaks, or actually Tisha B'Av. Rav Chanina speaks of abstaining entirely from immersing on Tisha B'Av because in the case of the Baraisa, the pool of cold water was not available, even though the hot springs were. So says the Gemara, Tashman. Now we're going to ask on Rav Chisda, when the Chazal said that on a Taanis Sibon, a public fast, you're not allowed to work. It's also lo yomer ela b'yom. They only say by day. Avo b'layla mutter, but the night of the fast. But on the night of the fast, you're allowed to. Kishamru also b'nilas asandul lo yomer ela b'ir. When they said that wearing shoes is not allowed, leather shoes only when you're in the city. Avo b'derech mutter. But on the way, on the road, of course, you're allowed to wear shoes. Side, what are we talking about? When one goes on the road, he puts on shoes. When he gets into the city, he removes the shoes. And the answer is the city streets are paved. The roads outside the city are not. When they say that one is prohibited from washing oneself. It's only talking about going all the way into a shower or a bath. But your face, hands, and feet, in order to do it aver, one at a time, your face, your hands, and your feet, you're allowed to. And so is the rule of somebody who's excommunicated or an avel. An avel, stam avelus, is 7 days, even though we keep it for shloishim. And stam nidu is shloishim yoim. An excommunication is stam for 30 days, similar to a nazir. Stam nazir is shloishim yoim. What's the din? Lava kulu, does it not refer to all the halachas of the brisa, even according to the regarding washing oneself? According to this, an oval is allowed to bathe his face, hands, and feet. Umayaskin, what are we talking about? We're dealing with hot water. He's allowed to wash his face. An oval is allowed to wash his face and his hands and his feet with hot water. But Rav Sheshes says, oval also lahashid be'etzba b'chamin. Rav Sheshes said an oval, a mourner, is also to even wash the small little pinky in hot water. Ella la b'tzayin. What are we talking about with cold? 13A3, and which means that you're allowed to always use cold only in a limited way. This is a shlug up. This is a question on Rav Chisda, who says that on a Taanis Sibor, one is allowed to wash his entire body with cold water because it's only a case of you're prohibiting yourself from pleasure. Bathing in cold water is not pleasurable. So therefore, there's no problem. It's not a question of losing your empathy. Says the Gemara, loy. No. Loy lo b'chamet. The emesin you're dealing with when one washes himself with hot water. The kakashalach. Guys, keep flagging. You're going to go ask the question, how do you reconcile Rav Sheshes, who says that an oval can't even wash his little finger? It says like this. You'll say like this. To the one that's been excommunicated for 30 days and an oval, Ashara Koyi, we're relating back to the other prohibitions, but not to washing. In other words, he's rolling back to the beginning of the Baraisa. The Isser against washing is mentioned by the Brisa only with regard to a Taanis Sibur, a public fast day, on which hot water is permitted for the face, hands, and feet, and cold water is permitted for the entire body. So the Mela, in fact, the Brisa is a riot to Rav Chisda that you're allowed to wash yourself on a public fast day. And again, the pshat is like this. The public fast day, the Taanis Sibur, is because you're not supposed to be Parish Minat Sibur. You're not going to separate yourself out from the community. You have to join the community in their tsar, in their distress. You have to have empathy for your fellow Jew. You have to put yourself in their shoes. So that means you have to feel pain. Bathing in cold water clearly is not pleasurable. If anything, it distresses you further. No problem, you can do it. Toshma, we have a comment, let's say, the Rab Abba Koyin Mishum Rab Yossi HaKoyin. Rab Abba the Koyin said in the name of Yossi HaKoyin. Maisa, there was a Maisu Mason, Rab Yossi ben Rabbi Chanina. Unfortunately, two sons of Rabbi Yossi ben Chanina passed away. V'rochatz b'tzayin and kol shiva, and he washed himself in cold water during the entire 7 days of Shiva. So you see from Rabbi Yossi's conduct that he's allowed to wash his entire body in cold water, even somebody who's an ovel, who's a real mourner, which is, of course, against what Rav Chisda said, because Rav Chisda said you can only do that on a Taanis Sibur when it has to do with Tanug. Says the Gemara, also.
Actually, he had to hold Shiva 14 days.
Say that.
They didn't die at the same time.
No, Daddy, that's the next piece of Gemara. You're jumping the story.
Right here.
Right here.
That's why they allowed him. That's why they allowed him, because it's too long.
Daddy, now the Gemara says that. Ha, empty the Gemara. Ha, some it was a case where they didn't die together. Unfortunately, okay. One after the other. You jumped the gun. You're one after the other. Titania tikafu avalam zachazeh. When unfortunately periods of abelus follow one right after the other. If your hair gets too heavy because of too much growth, I don't know what this Gemara is talking about, but for those who have hair on their head, they understand this Gemara. What he called, he can lighten it with a razor. And he's allowed to launder his garments with water. So you see that you have the right in such a case. Of course you're allowed to, because covered abri is shani. Nobody's expected to go from one avelis to another avelis without pulling himself together. But in a normal situation, an ovel cannot bathe even with cold water, just like Rav Chisda. Amar Rav Chisda, and in fact, Rav Chisda says it. Ubetar, this which the Brisa just said, allow the hair cutting with a razor, avoloi b'misvah, but not with scissors. B'mayim, with water, right? You're allowed to laundry with water, avoloi b'nesa, avoloi b'chol, but not with detergent. Amar Rava, Rava says, in fact, an ovel, a mourner, is allowed to bathe himself with cold water the entire 7 days of mourning. Like the cake, just like meat and wine. Even though those two things, meat and wine, provide enjoyment, an ovel is still allowed to have meat and wine. In fact, we don't actually hold this way, but this is Rava. Meisvei, so they ask on Rava. We're now on Amid Beis, Yud Gimel Amid Beis, 13b1. 13b1 says the Gemara, Ein habayga. This is a Moiridic thing, and it's a great lesson in tznius, as I'll explain in a second. A bagra, a nara, is somebody who's 12 years old. A bagra is somebody who became 12 and a half. when a girl got to 12 and a half and wasn't yet married back in the day, it was a groise shanda. Okay?
In
So,
those days.
because they didn't live as long. So everything, what it calls. So again, a Nara is 12. A Bagra is 12 and a half. So this girl is still single at 12 and a half, and unfortunately, she's sitting shiva. Says the Gemara, Ein haboigris rishoyel in navel esatzmo. A boigris is not allowed. It's actually an isser to make herself unpresentable at the shiva. Bimei Evel Avia during the time of her father's mourning. And we're going to go according to the pshat where she's mourning her father. Okay? Hanara, but someone who's 12, who's not yet of marriageable age. She's in that in-between stage of childhood and adulthood. Rishoy is allowed to look unpresentable. She doesn't have to put on makeup. But in fact, the Mefarshim explains she's allowed, but in fact, she's also allowed to put on makeup to look good. So Zogti Gemara, what are we talking about? Lav berechitza, bepashtis, we're talking about that the girl is allowed to wash herself. Ubemai, with what kind of water? Ilema bechamin, if you're going to say she's allowed to wash herself with hot water, ein bageres rishoy. But what do you call it? The brisa that says that a bageres is not allowed to make herself unattractive would mean that she's allowed to bathe herself in hot water. But Rav Chisda himself said, Oval also lahashit etzboi bechamin. Rav Chisda and Rav Shesha said the same thing, that an oval is not even allowed to put his little finger into hot water. El olav b'tzaynim. We must be talking about cold water, saying that a bagra, 12-and-a-half-year-old girl not married, is allowed to wash herself in cold water, but everybody else is not. That refutes Rava, who said you're allowed to wash, that an oval is allowed to wash himself all 7 days in cold water. And for the Gemara loy, no, it means akichul upirkus. It means painting her eyelids and braiding her hair, which is also for all other mourners, but not for a girl who is of marriageable age. So in fact, you see from this Gemara that even if a girl is an ovel, she needs to put on makeup and make her hair presentable when she's going out in the public, when she's sitting publicly to receive the people who are coming to console.
I think the same thing applies to a wife. She should look presentable for her husband, so you shouldn't see her in looking.
So in fact, I'm about to get there. The first thing here is an unbelievable rule in tznius. Too often, people scream tznius, tznius. See, all the problems in the world are about tznius. You know, it's the easy fix. Something happens, tznius. In fact, tznius does not mean looking like a dump. Kol kevoida basmelech penina. Our women are queens and are princesses. You know how they're supposed to dress? Like Kate Middleton. They're supposed to be presentable. They're not supposed to look provocative, but they're absolutely supposed to look classy. That this idea that they're supposed to look dumpy, that it comes out of too many schools, frankly, has no location in halacha, as far as I can see. The Gemara takes it as a double borrow that even during Avelus, a girl has got to look good. And
the wife too.
And that's what I'm about to take it. If Madach by Avelus, alachas kama v'kama when it's not Avelus, and a wife loy kol sheken, because the mitzvah is that she has to look good for her husband. There's no question about it. It's the same thing. Not looking good is not tznius. Just the opposite. So when they come and they're dressed schlumpy and all that, oh, it's tznius. I'm wearing skirts down to the floor. I'm not putting on makeup. So Sam wissen, it's not Yiddishkeit. It's not Yiddishkeit. It seemed clear as day from this Gemara. Anyways, weiter. Labor Messiah, we can learn from this Maisa, the same Maisa we had before. There's going to be a lot of repetition now. The Amar Abba Kakoyin Mishum Rabbi Yossi Akoyin Maisa Umeisa Gonam Shal Rabbi Yossi Ben Chanina, and the sons of Rabbi Yossi Ben Chanina passed away. Baruch has been called Shiva, and he bathed in cold water the entire day. Kash, just like Rava said that you're allowed to bathe all day. Says the Gemara, no proof. Amri, over there, the morning was one after the other. Unfortunately, his kids were passed away one right after the other. The Tanya, because we learned if periods of mourning happen one right after the other, if your hair gets too heavy, you're allowed to lighten it with a razor. And you're allowed to launder your garments with water. But stamazo, you're not allowed to. So you have no proof from Rava that the Rava's position that you're allowed to bathe in cold water. Maybe a regular oval is not allowed to bathe in cold water. Amar Rav Chisda, Betar, Abuloibim is Pesayim. You're allowed to cut with a razor, but not with a scissor. You have to make some sort of change, a shinui. B'mayim b'loibim nesim b'loibim chol b'loibim b'hala. Bottom line is, and you're not allowed to bathe, you're not allowed to laundry with detergent. Ikadi Amri, others have another way. Amar Rava, Rava said, Aval Asur b'tzayin and shel shiva. This was another version. This version is just the opposite of what we learned before. Rava says a mourner is also to bathe even in cold water during the entire 7 days. Then if that's the case, why does Rava allow them to eat meat and wine, which is also pleasurable? He does it to ease his anxiety. In other words, he's all anxious. A relative passed away. And so what you do is we give him wine, we give him meat and wine and give him the chance to go to sleep, make him fall asleep and calm himself down. Being clean is the same thing. So we guys are a bunch of big shots because we live in a house of running water. And we're to take a shower is the simplest thing in the world. We all have bathrooms right off our bedrooms, right? No problem. Everybody remembers that, in fact, in the ancient world, the Goyim got bathed twice in a lifetime, when they were born and when they died, which is the reason why the Jews did not die from the Black Plague the way that the Goyim did, because the Jews bathed. Every Jew bathed before Shabbos. Every woman bathed at least once a month and Shabbos. So they were much cleaner. Nonetheless, taking baths on a constant basis, taking shower on a constant basis was really almost an impossibility. And since it was almost an impossibility, that's why we're talking about over here that the easing of the anxiety was giving meat and wine, not the bathing. Says the Gemara, Messiah, maybe I could bring proof to this version of Rava. We're now on 13b2. 13b2. And again, this is all a repeat now. We're about to have a repeat. Ein Bageretz Rishol and Navalatzma. A Bagris, someone who's 12, a girl that's 12 and a half, not married, is not allowed to make herself repulsive, unpresentable during Shiva. A Nara Rishol, but a Nara, a 12-year-old, is allowed to, doesn't have to. She could also put on makeup, but she doesn't have to. We might. What are we talking about? We're talking about bathing in hot water. Ein Bagris Rishol. This is what we're saying, that a Bagris who's not permitted to look unpresentable is allowed to bathe in hot water. An oval is not even allowed to bathe a little finger in hot water during the Shiva. Elalab, beside it teaches us that a Bagra is allowed to bathe in what they call in cold water, but it does apply to everybody else that you're not to, right? What do you call it? And this would support Rava, the second version of Rava, which said Aval also right? That it also is not allowed to. Says, but no, we're talking about Bechila. We're talking about makeup and braiding the hair. In other words, normally you're not allowed to look so great at the Shiva, but a girl who's not married yet must look great at the Shiva. And that's her tznius. You shouldn't think otherwise. Okay? Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Chisda, Zayse Meres, to conclude this, Aval also Boy says shel kol
Tarpoises.
Tachboy says shel shiva, that an oval, it does not laundry the entire 7 days. So as we know, how do we sit, unfortunately, by a shiva? We sit in the same clothes day after day after day after day. Nonetheless, the Rabbanon today do say that your underwear, of course, you should change. And that includes the socks, okay? It's just the outerwear, specifically your pants and your shirt and the jacket that you wear when you daven. And of course, we're not talking about Shabbos. The hilchasa, the halacha is, all the loss of lirchas kol gufa. A mourner cannot wash his entire body. He can't wash it neither hot or cold. Cold shiva all 7 days. Aval pon of yodav v'ragla, but his face, hands, and feet. The chamin also with sign and motor. With hot water, no. With cold water, yes. Aval to anoint himself, apilu kol shu aser, even minimally is prohibited. But the im lavares as zuhama, but to remove filth and not for pleasure, that mutter is allowed. Kovid habrias shani, and of course the Ritva says, and the article brings it down to number 14 on the bottom. For medicine purposes, you certainly allow. So if somebody has a rash, you're allowed to anoint yourself with whatever the doctor says you can anoint yourself with. Now back to our question. When we talked about till now, anenu. When do we say anenu? Now we know we say it when, everybody? By Shema Kolenu. Right? Before we say the words Kiata Shema Tvilas Kol Pa'am Yisrael Barachmim, we plug in anenu.
It's included in the Shema Kolenu.
Shema Kolenu. But we do that because that's after the story. How do we know we do that? So back up. Right now, we have no idea when we say it. Right. Let's finish this tomorrow. So Loisa de Taniso, the prayer of the Taanis, i.e. Anenu, Heichim Mad Karninon. Where do we place it? Adaber Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Yitzchak Beren. Rabbi Yehuda took his son Rabbi Yitzchak for a walk. The Doresh. And what does a father do with a son? They talked in learning. Yochid Shekibul Allah Taanis. An individual accepts on himself a fast. The Spalin Shal Taanis says Anenu. The Heichen Imrim, where does he put it? Ben Goyal L'Roifa, between the 7th and 8th brachas, between Gogal Yisrael and Rifeinu Hashem, which, by the way, that's what we do when we repeat the Shemona Esrei. That's when we put in extra tefillas right over there. But anyways, Maskeflo Rabbi Yitzchak, is it an individual allowed to make a separate bracha in the Shemona Esrei for himself? Kayachid can't do this. Ella Omer Rabbi Yitzchak b'Shemei Tefillah. By Shemei Tefillah, v'chein Omer Rabbi Sheshes b'Shemei Tefillah. Meisvei. Believe it, and so the Gemara is going to ask on Rabbi Yitzchak and Rabbi Sheshes. Let's say you put it by Shemei Tefillah. The Bryce says as follows: Ein Beit Yochid L'Tzibor. There's no difference between an individual and the tzibur, the public, regarding saying Anenu on a fast, except that the individual prays 18 blessings. In other words, he doesn't make an extra bracha, he just simply plugs Anenu into where? Into the middle of Shema Kilenu. And he doesn't end it with a bracha. When he finishes, he says, so he expands within a bracha. Anenu, it's part of Anenu becomes now part of the 18. But the public davens 19 blessings, which is like we do. The Shliach Tzibur, the guy leading the thing, when he repeats, he says Anenu b'yom tzara, right?
Right.
In between Yisrael and Rifeinu. So, Frank the Gemara, what is
they didn't have in those days yet? They didn't have La Malshinim yet. They didn't
have
substitute.
Well, again, we automatically have 19 brachas because of Lama Shilim, because of, let's be honest, the Noitzrim, the Nazarites,
Right.
and everybody else that came along. That would be the Catholics. But
The Baitusim, the Karaim, the Reform Jews.
well, yeah, exactly. So the what do you call it? So we say 19.
When did Malshinim start?
Ramashinim came after the destruction,
Right.
or either at the end or after the destruction. I believe it came after the destruction. So
But
now, but Daddy,
I'm-
we still call it Shmoina Esrei. We still
Right.
call it Shmoina Esrei because that's what we remember. So the reality is, if you want to learn this Gemara, you would learn this Gemara. We say 19 brachas and they say 20 brachas. That's all. But the Gemara is going to go off from this anyways in a minute. Jerry, I'm not 100% sure when Lamashinim. It's in brachas. In Masechtas brachas, they discuss it. I just don't remember exactly.
It was the Amshik Knesset Agdoili.
No, the Knesset Gedolah was much earlier. The Knesset Gedolah was before the building of the second base.
You had no Malshinim. You're talking about by Bavel and before Bavel. I mean, this is a general. No, this is a general.
Yeah. So Shmoina Esrei was put together by the Anshe Knesset Gedolah. That means after the Purim Bayis, after the story of Purim, they put together the Siddur as we know it. Malal Mashinim came much later, was not part of the original 18. It was much, much later. It was definitely in the times of the Romans, not the Persians and the Greeks. It definitely came in the time of the Romans, and I believe it came after the destruction. And I'll tell you why too. If you look over here, it says Rav Yitzchak, Rav Yehuda, which means that they were not Tanoim, they were Amoraim. The Amoraim didn't come about until the death of Rebbe HaKadosh. Rav, first Amoira, Rav and Shmuel, that was about 100 or so years after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. So I think Lamashinim came about. Probably very close to the Council of Nice, when the Catholics really broke off from Judaism. At that point, I think that's when Lamashinim came about. I could be wrong. I think that's it. I'll Google it. We can all Google it after the shir. Let's keep going over here. So the Gemara says, "My yochid u'may tzibur." What does this brayso mean by an individual and a public? Ilema yochid mamish. And now we're on 13b3. 13b3. If it means an actual individual who says Shemona Esrei for himself, a shliach, the tzibur, shliach tzibur. And the public means the shliach tzibur, the one who's davening in front of the other, one who goes up to the amud. Hani Teisha Esrei, Esra Boim. There are 24 blessings, which we're going to see later. The Mishnah on Daf Tezvav, on the Daf 15, is going to enumerate these. So, Ella Lav Hachikama. Ein Ben Yochid the Kabbalah Olav Taanis Yochid. There's no difference between an individual who accepts on himself the idea of a personal fast. Or an individual accepts on himself the stringencies of a public fast. The one who just does a personal fast, davens 18 and puts Anenu in Shemei Tefillah. The one who accepts on himself the stringency of a public fast says Anenu by itself, its own bracha. Shema minyan. Learn Yachid Kaveya bracha latzmi, that an individual could, yes, establish a separate bracha for himself in Shemona Esrei, because he's established for himself his own Anenu between Gal Yisol and Rifeinu, even though he's Yachid, because he accepted upon himself all the stringency of a public fast. Says the Gemara, no. We're talking about the shliach tzibur. The kakashalon, you're going to ask shliach tzibur esma boy matzli. The shliach tzibur daven says 24 brachas and not 19, as we're going to see in the Mishnah on Daf Yutes Vav. The Gimel Taanis Rishonis. The Bryce is talking about the first 3 public fasts that the Yechidim fast, that are not really public fasts, only the distinguished individuals fast. It's still Mar Cheshvan, and the rains hadn't fallen, so they're the ones where the 24 blessings are not recited. Says the Gemara, the law is that a fact that the 24 brachas are not recited in the fast of the Yechidim. It says there's no difference. Gimel Rishon is the Gimel Emtsayis. There's no difference between the first 3 and the middle 3 fasts in Kislev. Except the first 3 fasts, they're allowed to work. The Ilu is Malacha, and the other fasts, you're not allowed to work. And the Gemara, Ella, the 20.
But as far as the 24, they're the same.
Right, the 24, they're exactly the same. The only difference is work. So, and for the Gemara, ton of Ishayi. The Bryce is teaching a distinction between the first and the second, but it left off some details. It only mentioned some of the differences, but it didn't mention one of the other differences, is that the first, you don't say the 24 brachas, and the second set, you do say the 24 brachas. Right, the Gemara, really? My Shaya, what was left out? The high Shaya, that you said the 24 brachas were left out. The Bryce would not normally leave out such an important fact.
Yeah.
You have to say extra brachas from 20. We add 6 extra brachas to Shemona Esrei. The Su, it says there's no difference between them except for malacha, which means that it is including everything. Ella Tana Bi Suri Kamairi. The time of the last price, is only talking about the isurim, the prohibitions of the fast day. The tefillah he's not discussing the davenings. So therefore, there is a difference. But the first fast, there is no 24 tefillahs, and the second one there is. It's not brought down because that's not the topic of the brisa. The iba yisema, you can answer them. You can say very simple that not only the first 3. The first 3 fasts, we didn't say the Chav Dalet Tefillos, but the middle fasts, we also didn't say the Chav Dalet Tefillos. We saved it for the last 3 fasts, right? The last 7 fasts, actually. Okay? Now we're on the Gemara 13b4, getting to the end. Says the Gemara, V'loi, is that a fact that in the middle, the second series of fasts, we didn't say the 24 Tefillos. That can't be. But Tanya, we learned in a Brisa. There's no difference between the second 3, the middle 3, and the last 7. The last 7, we blow on the shofar, we cry out and lock the stores. We say extra salichos and blow the shofar, lock the stores. And the middle 3, we don't do that. But everything else, zeb is shoving. Which means just like the last 7, you say the 24 tefillos. So too in the middle 3, you say the 24 tefillos. Says the Gemara, v'chitem, if you're going to try to get out of this by saying, hachanami, tono, the shaya, that between the second and the last set of 7, he lists some, but not all the differences. You can't say that the Brisa clearly says there's no difference between them except for blowing on the shofar and shutting the stores. So something Gemara v'tispera ain bein dafka. Do you really think that the distinction over here is meant to be meant literally that there's no difference between them? We're on tomorrow's daf. Yudalit Amid Aleph. Shaya table. But the Brisa left over the matter of moving the ark. In other words, the bima. When it comes to the last 7 fasts, they actually moved the bima out of the shul and moved it into the town square. so that it would be a public spectacle and people who even weren't coming to shul would join in. So you see from over here that the Baraisa does omit other distinctions between the second set of fats and the last 7 fats. So the Gemara, Imishum Teva, if regarding the removal of the ark, that's lav sharihu. That's not an omission. Merely the tzniya katani, the Bryce only put about private matters, things that take place indoor, ritual matters that take place indoors. Merely the fahesya, like katani, public stuff it doesn't talk about. It could be that the distinctions between the middle and the final set of Tanesim is complete, and that the Chav Dalet Tfilas, which are said privately inside the shul, are also recited by the middle Tanesim. It's not a raya. So Amar Rav Ashi Masnisin Navideko. The Tani, because we learned in the Mishnah, Ma Elu Yiseris Al Rishonis. In which aspect are the final 7 Tanesim more stringent than the previous 3 Tanesim? Only in that we blow on the last 7, we cry out with extra slichas and shofar and lock the stores. Everything else, zev is shovin, which means that even the middle ones do say the chaf dalet tfilas. If we're going to say hachanami, you're right. Tani b'shayer. Here again, we left things out. But it says, in what are these? Implying that there is no difference outside of blowing the shofar and crying out and closing the stores. V'tispara ma elu dafkahu. That it means dafka hashayile teva. But we got the fact that they left out the ark that was brought out in the last 7 into the public market. The imishum teva lav shayu the chashiv lebi idach birka. In fact, the teva is not considered omission because the Mishnah in the next parak, in parak Sheni, talks about the removal of the bima from the shul into the public square. Says the Gemara, if that's the case, now that you come to this, that it's not an omission because we're going to get to it in the next parak. The distinction between the 24 blessings is also not an omission. The Tani law be either pirka, because we're going to be discussing about the 24 brachas that are recited during the last seven fasts, which imply that in the second 3 they are not said. My Havi Allah. So what's the final? After having gone on about this for about a daf, what's the answer? And this is where we're going to end.
What's the
Sasratoi Omer Rav Chia Barashi Omer Rav V'chein Omer Rav Chia Barashi Omer Rav Ben Goyal L'Roifa. An individual, according to him, says Anenu between Goyal Yisrael and Rifeinu as a completely separate bracha, and even the individual finishes up, puts in an extra bracha into Shemona Esrei. Rav Ashi Omer Mishmei Rav Yanai Berei Rav Yishmael V'Shomea Tefillah, that an individual davening puts Anenu into the tefillah of Shemea Tefillah and does not finish it, but keeps it as part of the bracha of Shemea Tefillah. The hilchas of Shemea Tefillah, and the answer is, and the halacha is, we put it in by Shemea Tefillah. And that is, of course, what we do. That's what we do, okay? That is what we do. We private people do it by Shemea Tefillah. And when it's repeated by the Shliach Tzibur publicly, he puts in an entirely extra bracha between Goyal Yisrael and Rifeinu. Very good.